for our panel number 2 of our conference on formal title, Religion and the Social Transition of Contemporary China. Our topic is religious freedom in China, Chinese and Western perspectives. This is an issue that gets a lot of attention in the United States, and we are very fortunate to have a very distinguished panel consisting of 2 Chinese presenters, 1 American presenter, and comments by Ambassador Hanford, and then we'll open the floor for questions and further discussion until we run out of time. We're going to start with the biomaterial on the speakers is available to all of you, so I'm not going to introduce the speakers in any detail. Professor Wang is from Tsinghua University. Professor Liu Peng on his left is with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Professor Farr is with Georgetown University. And Ambassador Hanford used to be our ambassador at large for international religious freedom. Is that the right title? And where are you now?
I'm actually taking a sabbatical right now. We just had a newborn, our 5th child, so.
That doesn't sound like a sabbatical to me. That's Professor Wang, would you care to lead off? Okay.
好，各位女士、各位先生、各位朋友，下午好。能在这个会议上发表我的论文，我感到非常荣幸。我非常感谢Stephen Roy 先生的邀请，也感谢其他几位特别是何子健先生还有 Chris 他们特意今年6月份到杭州给我送来邀请信，非常感谢。 我在最后1分钟改变了主意，用中文发表。我这个论文的题目是《全球化背景下的中国宗教信仰自由》。在这篇论文中间，我主要讨论3个问题。第一个是一个概念上的澄清，到底是宗教信仰自由还是宗教自由？第二个问题，我们现在考察。 观察中国的宗教信仰自由状态，应当在什么视野下去观察？第3个问题可能和今天这个讨论的主题呢有点远这是我们最近的一些中国学者在那里努力的要建构这个在中国努力建构宗教共同体。我认为我们做的工作也是有利于贯彻宗教信仰自由的。 因为时间关系，我不可能逐字逐句的念，这个我挑最重要的地方讲一讲。信仰是宗教的核心，宗教信仰自由是当代宗教的核心问题。在当今世界全球化的大背景之下，贯彻宗教信仰自由的原则，关系到中国社会的长治久安，关系到全体中国人民的生活幸福，对于 当代中国社会具有十分重要的意义。如果我们从这一个基本点出发，对中国宗教信仰自由的现状进行考察、反思和评论，那么任何人都不会轻视这一问题的重要性，也不会对此产生根本的意见分歧。我说这段话是我的一个大前提。我设定，现今全球任何一个国家、任何一个个人， 他关心这个问题，关心中国的宗教信仰自由的状况。我认为，他的出发点是为了中国社会的长治久安，是为了全中国人民的生活幸福。从这个出发点考察这个问题的。当然了，这是我的假设。那么具体的考察人从哪个地方出发，这由不得我掌握。但是我在这里讨论的问题呢， 还是把这一点作为出发点。第二这个整个文章第一个要讨论的问题呢，是宗教信仰自由还是宗教自由？自从中国社会改革开放以来，国际学术界 对中国社会的宗教信仰现状做了大量考察。一般说来，学者们对什么是宗教信仰自由，中国社会要不要贯彻宗教信仰自由，看法基本上是一致的。但对于什么是宗教自由，中国社会要不要贯彻宗教自由，在这个问题上看法有分歧。而学术界这种认识上的分歧，也在影响着中国社会各个阶层对宗教的根本认识。我个人的思考认为，宗教信仰自由和宗教自由，这是这两个复合概念的这个内涵，它的重合度是非常高的，它的外延是有差别的。如果我们撇开宗教这个维度，那么他们是信仰自由和自由的关系；如果撇开自由这个维度，他们则是宗教信仰和宗教的关系。1948年12月10日，联合国大会通过并颁布了《世界人权宣言》，它的第18条指出，人人有思想、良心和宗教自由的权利，此项权利等等等等等等啊。我认为呢，在这里所讲的各种这个宗教自由他讲的这个宗教自由是包含宗教信仰自由在内的。宗教信仰自由是宗教自由的基本组成部分。我在下面引述了各个国家的宪法的不同的规定这个我就不念，这个我就不再念了，我只到这个最后这一段。我个人的理解，信仰是宗教的核心，信仰必须是自由的，不自由的东西不能作为信仰来接受。从理论上说，宗教信仰自由言之成理，也为广大民众接受。而宗教活动因其内涵比较复杂，又因为宗教活动自由不是绝对的自由，故而一般的提宗教活动自由，容易引起误解，对民众也容易产生误导。所以在中国当前的具体国情下，使用宗教信仰自由的提法，我认为似乎是更加稳妥。而世界上一部分国家所提的宗教自由，与中国政府中国社会所提的宗教信仰自由的内涵，大部分是重合的。我下面讲第二部分，到底是我们观察这个中国宗教信仰自由的现状，应该以什么样的眼光去观察？中外学者，我认为对宗教信仰自由或宗教自由的理解上差异不大，但是依据各自理解对中国宗教现状进行观察和评价时候，这个具体的评价出来的结果差别不小。我注意到，当前有一些外国人士和外国机构对中国宗教现状的批评的焦点，不是集中在中国政府愿不愿意，或者想不想贯彻宗教信仰自由方面，而是集中在宗教活动自由方面。我这里举个例子 ，David Ackerman， 他到北京访问的时候，我在清华见过他，我跟他谈过话。他后来出的那个书中间Jesus in Beijing 这本书里头，他说，与1949年到1976年相比，中国是个人自由的乐园。然而，与世界上其他大多数主要国家相比，中国在宗教自由和表达自由方面，仍旧远远落在后面。在引述了中国宪法关于宗教信仰的自由的条款以后，他感叹说，一切都令人印象深刻。但是他接下去马上就分析说，问题既在于定义什么是正常的宗教活动，又在于宗教活动场所管理的规定的内容。他说，正常的宗教活动不包括普通意义上的基督教福音的传教，而在大多数现代社会，宗教自由就是这样被界定的。至于那些关于场所的规定，他们是用来防范基督徒 或任何其他信仰的信徒，跨越司法的界限，去和其他中国人分享他们的信仰。我认为，这位先生对中国宗教状况的分析存在着以下3个问题：第一，对宗教信仰自由和宗教活动自由，David 他没有做任何具体的区别，在很多地方是把2者混为一谈的。第二，他认为现代社会的宗教自由可以不受司法约束，而中国政府在保障宗教信仰自由的同时，又强调依法管理宗教，因此中国人实际上没有宗教自由。这是我认为David 他的这个分析的第2个问题。第3个问题，我认为 David 他是在所谓现代视野下分析中国宗教状况的，他的分析缺乏一个全球的视野。我个人对前面这个问题的看法，前2点的看法，我在我刚才表述论文第1部分的时候我已经讲到了，在这里我再讲一下，着重讲一下第3个问题。分析一个国家的宗教现状或者宗教信仰的现状，需要审视其时代背景与社会生活的变化。对同一对象进行分析的时候，具有现代视野的学者和具备全球视野的学者得出来的结论是大不相同的。我这里讲的所谓具有现代视野的学者，他们在观察问题的时候，首先是把宗教自由或者宗教信仰自由看作是一个凝固的一个东西，或者是有一个典型的模式放在那里，需要其他任何人、任何社会都要向这个模式靠拢的这么一个东西，是吧？它是用单一的模式去裁剪各个国家丰富多样的社会生活。与这种观察相比较，拥有全球视野的学者不同，他们将宗教信仰自由视为一个它的内涵有待于进一步探讨确定的概念，认为在当今全球化时代，宗教信仰自由与不同的族群、不同文化背景的人们的要求纠结在一起。以往所谓现代的对宗教自由的解释需要进一步的理清。历史的看问题，整个世界在16世纪西欧的宗教改革之前，宗教自由或者宗教宽容是比较罕见的。经历了文艺复兴和启蒙运动以后，宗教自由在欧美各国逐渐成为现实。它的特点是反对传统宗教，反对传统宗教的主导权，反对宗教非理性的偏见和狭隘。18世纪以后，欧洲各国逐渐完成了世俗化，宗教与世俗的分立，支配了人们对宗教自由的理解。一方面是包括宗教信仰自由权利在内的个人权利的神圣不可侵犯，另一方面是宗教逐渐淡出公共领域和社会生活。19世纪以来，宗教信仰自由作为公民的一项基本权利，已经成为一般的共识。以宗教信仰自由等多项基本人权为基点，欧美社会逐渐形成了多样性共存的社会结构。宗教信仰自由既是支撑社会内部结构的基本观点，又是社会的价值标准的象征。由此看来，这种现代视野下的宗教自由观的特点是强调自由的绝对性，强调宗教与社会的分立，强调宗教与政治的分离。因为我看看还有多少时间？这几吧，还有多少？
还有5分钟。
还有5分钟啊！我尽快的 结束啊。下面这些分析呢，我都写在这儿，我就不多讲了。我在这里还要特别强调的一下的是，我刚才批评过的这个 David Ackerman 的先生的看法，他不是所有欧美学者的看法。我最近也读了一些其他国家的学者的看法。我这里举例子，加拿大学者James Miller， 他对中国政府对宗教场所的管理，他就有另外一番观察。他说，事实上，管理中国宗教的这套最新的法规，2004年公布，承认了中国宗教的新的现实，表现出一种清晰的变化。他不再把宗教放在政治意识形态的背景中加以考虑。新的法规不处理那些棘手的理论问题，诸如宗教的定义或者宗教迷信和科学信仰之间的关系，倒不如说他们试图集中在更加官僚主义的问题上，比如哪一个政府部门是处理各种类型的宗教问题的主管部门，或者像宗教朝觐和世俗旅游之间的关系这样的经济问题。这样的观察与 David Ackerman 的前面讲的那个看法相比，在我把这两个种看法一评价，我认为后者的观察比较客观。所以我最后可能快没时间了啊，我最后我就结个尾吧啊。处理宗教信仰自由与依法管理宗教的关系是一个世纪性的难题，是世界各国都需要加以认真处理的难题。中国政府对宗教信仰自由的理解已经有了十分清晰的表述，而且也反复重申了要贯彻宗教信仰自由原则的诚意。我认为对这一点是不用去怀疑的。各位学者，你们想想看，如果两个集团，或者是我们说的大一些，两个国家，如果是为了共同的把某个事情做好，是吧？但是一开始要合作了，要在那做了，却在怀疑对方不够，没有诚意，这样的合作能不能下去的？我想是不太可能的，是吧？所以我感到呢，就是这个中国的学者，我们当然要看到这个我们国家现在在贯彻宗教信仰自由与依法管理宗教这个问题的重要性，我们要继续的进行观察。另外的话呢，我们从这个一涉及到国家关系等等的，我也希望就是说国外的学者在观察这个分析这个问题的时候，还是要力求努力的客观，这样的结论呢恐怕更好一些。我这个想法呢，说白了在脑子里已经放了很多年了，因为那次 David Ackerman 到中国去访问，是吧？当时很多人都不愿意跟他接触，我的话呢，就在清华里我见了他，因为我想吧，我就是一个独立的我就是这么个学者，他跟我说要见面，那我就见了见，是吧？我也跟他谈了很长时间，还有今天早晨，是吧？也有记者朋友在座，我跟这个记者朋友也说几句。我在清华的时候，经常有记者找我，这个《华盛顿邮报》的，还有什么的。这个我在我的办公室里也见过很多记者，是吧？我发现记者们有一个特点，是吧？他不太喜欢跟我们讨论，像我们这些人讨论这个抽象的理论问题。像我刚才说的，宗教信仰自由与宗教自由有什么区别？他们一点兴趣都没有。我费了1个小时的时间，最后他说，我记得有一位记者是《华盛顿邮报》的记者，他是《华盛顿邮报》的驻京的首席代表。他找我谈了，我抽出时间跟他谈了。他听了以后，他感到，你说的这个东西好像跟中国政府讲的差不多吧？ 我想我这个差别还是很大的，我是有我自己的理解和体会在里头的。最后呢，他最后一看，他说你是个 philosopher， 我不想在这方面跟你多，你能不能给我讲个故事？哎呦，我说你们搞新闻记者的采访的目的就是听一个故事。那我说我仔细想想，我这个人缺乏文学想象力，是吧？我要亲身经历过的东西，我现在都不讲给你听。我要没有经历过的，我得去调查，我得搞清楚。所以我这个最后我没有时间了吧？
对，
这个我再强调，我今天因为时间关系，我把论文的第3部分内容我去掉了。这个我也希望呢，这个各位学者啊，这个会议结束以后有空的时候，把我这第3部分也看一看。我认为我们目前中国学者在这里做的这些事情，也是有利于在中国社会努力的贯彻宗教信仰自由的啊！谢谢大家啊，谢谢。
Thank you, Professor Wong. Professor Farr?
Okay. Is this on? Sounds like it. Well, Ambassador Roy, Ambassador Hanford, Professor Wong, and Professor Liu, my colleague, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. It's already a great deal of fun. I just thought that was a terrific piece. I'm tempted to entitle my response "In Defense of David Aikman." But I won't. I just want to be provocative. Although you'll see perhaps some commonalities between my remarks and those that have been attributed to David Aikman. I want to talk about religious freedom and American foreign policy. So it's kind of a policy talk, but it'll get to many of the issues raised by Professor Wong, and I think you'll see some agreements and some disagreements. Wouldn't be any fun if there were no disagreements. I think that everyone in the West shares the premise of my talk, which is that China is a major player in the world. It seeks to be, it is. And what happens in China has an impact not only on its own citizens, but on its neighbors, on the world, and on American interests, fundamental interests, including its national security. I think that's an unexceptional statement. Most analysts in the West and in the United States would agree with it. What I think they would not necessarily agree about is the extent to which religious freedom is a very important part of what's happening in China and what will happen in China over the next decades. And I'm going to argue that if China does not make fundamental changes in religious freedom, then it will have a destabilizing impact on China and will have negative implications for China's neighbors and for the United States. I'm delighted to be here at the Kissinger Center. Kissingerian realists are among the most prolific writers about China. I hope they're listening to this conference because they usually don't pay much attention to religion in China. And if I'm not mistaken, and I may well be, but someone can correct me if I'm wrong, the great Mr. Kissinger's book on China doesn't have a lot about religion in it. Am I wrong? Does anybody know? I'm not wrong. Okay, that's good. Beg pardon?
It's more about Kissinger.
Yeah, Kissinger's religion.
The fact of the matter is, this is, despite the vigorous participation in this conference, this is an issue that I think needs a great deal more study, and I applaud Woodrow Wilson and the Kissinger Institute for having this. Let me just talk in two broad areas. One, the way I see the status of religious freedom in China, and two, what I think the West, or frankly, I shouldn't say the West, I should say all countries that feel they have interest in China, ought to be doing to encourage China to embrace religious freedom. I like Professor Wong's phrase, I wrote it down as, they must conclude religious freedom is good for the happiness of the Chinese people. I like that. I think that's right. I want to come back to that. The problem is pretty serious, as I see it. If you look at the data, if you look at, for example, the annual reports on religious freedom that have been put out for the last 11 years by the State Department, China is among 6 or 8 countries of the world that are labeled as the worst persecutors on religious freedom, guilty of systematic, ongoing violations of religious freedom, violent religious persecution in some cases, in other cases simply systematic discrimination, which sometimes breaks out in crackdowns on religious believers. The Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, Brian, I believe you spoke this morning, and I'm sure you talked about the results of the China results of your latest publication. It's very troubling to me that while this report says that the religious restrictions imposed by the Chinese government remain very high, what we're beginning to see is an increase in social hostility among the Chinese people toward religion. This, to me, is terrifically troubling. So I think what we have is a systematic and ongoing worry about religion as somehow being a destabilizing and potentially dangerous force within Chinese society. And to me, the way to deal with that is to convince the Chinese, as Mr. Wong puts it, that religious freedom is good for the happiness of the Chinese people. In other words, to make an argument about the self-interest of the Chinese people. I'll come back to that in just a minute. But first, I want to just ruminate for a minute about why this is true. Why, if it is true, and of course it's debatable, but I mean, I take it as a given that this is a serious problem within China. Serious for Tibetan Buddhists, serious for Muslims in the Xinjiang province, serious for Falun Gong, serious for house church Christians, serious for Catholic underground clergy, and all the others who are subject periodically to violent persecution, unjust imprisonment, house arrest, torture, marginalization in one form or another. Why is this the case? Well, there's lots to be said about this. Let me just point out 2 things. I think that there's a false anthropology of Chinese communism that derives from Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism that's still at work in some perfidious way. And that false anthropology denies the fundamental religious nature of human beings. It doesn't matter whether they're Chinese or Greek or French, and that last one is probably tougher than the Chinese, but people want to know the answers to the religious questions by virtue of their humanity. They want to know whether there's something out there that to whom they owe or to which they owe their existence, and if so, whether they should attune their behavior to that person or thing, and whether there's a life after death, etc., etc. People want to know this. These are the religious questions. It's natural. Some would argue it's a human good for human beings to seek the answers to these questions, and indeed, when they get the answers, they want to live in accord with the answers, with the obligations that ensue from the answers. And to get to Mr. Wong's point about the distinction between belief and action, I've never known a religious, well, that's not quite right, but I know very few religious people who take their religious beliefs and say they're mine. They have nothing to do with the way I live my life. They have nothing to do with the political society in which I live. They have nothing to do with anything that I do except my belief. So my point is, religious freedom means more than freedom of belief. It means the right to act on belief. Of course, it is not absolute. Here again, we agree. Because when you act in any way, there are restrictions on what you do. So, for example, if you want to build a house of worship, you can't just go build it in the middle of a highway or in the middle of a residence. It's proper for a state to have some restrictions on religion. But it is not proper for a state, any state, China or any other, to say that religious freedom consists only in the belief that people have. And you can do your mumbo-jumbo on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, or whatever day of the week it is, but don't bring it into the public square. That's not religious freedom. And it is certainly not the religious freedom that the United States has practiced since the beginning of this country, in which religion is invited into the public square. It's the very meaning of the First Amendment. So this notion that religious freedom came out of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, forgive me, came out of the American religious experience, which was primarily Protestant, with some contributions from the Enlightenment. But it didn't come out of the Enlightenment. It didn't come out of the Renaissance. It didn't come out of the rejection of religion from the public square. So there's a false anthropology in communism, and although I think China has made enormous strides in the economic realm in moving away from communism, I mean, you can be a capitalist in the Communist Party of China. You just can't be a religious believer. I mean, that tells you something. It's a little odd if you ask me, but it shows a practical strain. The way the Chinese have dealt with religion, of course, was first to try to destroy it in the Cultural Revolution. That was doomed to fail. As long as you have human beings, you're going to have religion. And since the Cultural Revolution, in my view, we have had 30 years of tinkering with the issue of how to control and manipulate religion. This isn't necessarily a criticism. I mean, you know, I could talk about France with similar tones. I mean, religion is potentially a problem. We need to control it. And I think that's what we see up until this day. If you look at the graph of the way China has treated religions, it goes up and down. But all of it is within the framework of trying to bureaucratize and control religious believers. It won't work. So let me move now to U.S. foreign policy. I'm making not a grand philosophical or theoretical or theological point. I'm making what I propose to be a very practical point. It won't work if you have human beings in your country. So, what does the United States do to try to promote religious freedom in China? It does many good things. But if you look at the United States government writ large, not simply at the State Department and certainly not simply at the Office of Religious Freedom, of which Ambassador Hanford was the head for 6 years, and I worked under him for about a year and a half. It means the United States government. Here are my comments about it. What we tend to do is try to promote religious freedom essentially through negative means. We have a report, which is very important, Religious Freedom Report. It's a gold standard. It's very good. So we identify the problem. And then we identify the worst persecutors. I think that's very important. China, as I said, has always been on that list. And then we essentially use stigmatization to try to change behavior. Now, there are very important exceptions to that. One of them was proposed by Ambassador Hanford when he was ambassador for religious freedom, when he proposed a joint working group, U.S.-China working group, that would be permanent. It wouldn't go away every time the Chinese got mad at the Americans for flying their planes too close or whatever it was that caused our relationship to go in the tank. You may recall that there was an incident involving American aircraft coming too close to a Chinese aircraft and vice versa, and the Chinese aircraft crashed. And so the human rights dialogue stopped for 3 or 4 years after that. Ambassador Hanford proposed something that would be permanent. It's still not there. It's still being worked. It was proposed, as I recall, back in 2002. So we're going on 10 years. It's time for it to be implemented because it would be a permanent institution. Let me wrap this up by saying the following. American international religious freedom policy, despite the best efforts of the good people that have been on the inside, and that includes me, although not necessarily the good people part, but I was on the inside. We, as a government, have used essentially negative approaches to promoting religious freedom. We're constantly reacting, in my view, to the problem, rather than getting in front of it. And I have 4 things that I want to quickly go through that I think fit into Professor Wong's religious freedom is good for the happiness of the Chinese people. These are doors that I think the Chinese have opened to us, not just the Americans, but anybody else that want to talk about why religious freedom might be in the interests of the Chinese people. Not just because we put you on a list or the United Nations says this or we say that or the Canadians, get after you. I mean, these human rights dialogues are great. I support them, but they don't get anywhere. They're, in my view, exercises in America management by the Chinese, and they're pretty good at it. 4 areas. First, the economy. Think what would happen if the Chinese government came to the conclusion that unregulated Protestant house churches were factories for the social habits that yield sustained economic activity. Emphasis on the word sustained. China has had economic growth for decades, but they're worried, and they should be, about sustaining economic growth. Suppose they were convinced that there was something in the religious nature of human beings that made them persistent in economic activity. Here, those of you who've heard of the Weber thesis and other work on this, not to mention the work of Brian Grimm and others who show that there is a correlation between religious freedom and economic opportunity and economic activity. Suppose you convince the Chinese that backing off on some of this would increase sustained economic growth. I think you'd have something to talk about. Second area, the law, the rule of law. Now, this is a subject that's been out there a lot. In fact, there's nothing new about any of the things I'm going to say. I'm just emphasizing them perhaps more than others and connecting them to religious freedom. The Chinese are a country of laws, there's no doubt about it. It's certainly not the American or Western understanding of law as limiting government and protecting individual liberties. It's the notion of law as a top-down accommodation for the common good of the people. So we're not going to change that with religious liberty, but we can work within it. And there's a guy named John Cam, Ambassador Hamsford knows him, perhaps Ambassador Roy has run across him. John Cam has been working for years in this field. You take Chinese law in the provinces as it is, and you train Chinese defense lawyers to protect religious actors and their ideas in Chinese courts based on the law that is there now. And abuses by whether it's the patriotic associations or the SARA or any others get prosecuted. Now, what this is sort of a bottom-up legal approach that could result in legal reform. The law, very important. Third, the academy. There are more Chinese scholars looking at religion than all of the American universities on the East Coast of the United States, probably in all of the United States. There are a lot of religious in the hinterlands. But on the East Coast, our elite universities don't pay nearly as much attention to religion as the Chinese Academy does. The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, the international religion aspect of that. Now, some of this is studying the enemy. Some of this is the Chinese imperative to understand that which we don't understand, but we darn sure better understand because they're a threat to us. Well, okay, fair enough. It is what it is. But there are Chinese scholars all over the world trying to figure out what's going on. There's an opportunity here. And the State Department, to their credit, have taken advantage of some of this. We have international visitor programs. We have all kinds of activities. But I think we really need a kind of a Marshall Plan. Maybe that's too dramatic. We need to systematize this. It's too ad hoc. There's no strategy. You know, some people run this program, some people run that program. This is very important. These scholars are very important to China. Professor Wang and Professor Liu are very important to their countries. The fact that they're studying this is something that we should be paying policy attention to. Gaining them access, developing conferences, getting the research of people like Brian Grimm and Roger Finke and others, this economic model I'm talking about, Robert Barrow at Harvard and others. China scholars ought to be looking at this stuff because it can come back to the policy world that way.
2 minutes.
Good. My wife says you've always got to have a reason to shut up, and I've just been given one. Permanent Sino-American policy institutions. I've already mentioned this. Ambassador Hanford proposed one. It's a good idea. It needs to be multi-agency. It needs to be permanent. It needs to be taken out of the stream of the political human rights dialogues that go back and forth. You need NGOs, you need scholars, you need religious people involved in this, and it needs to be ongoing. Unfortunately, you need money for such a thing, too. This is a problem in today's climate, but nevertheless, this is an idea whose time I think has come. So, to wrap up, China is a huge player. It's important to the United States. It's important to the world. We're not going to induce change. We're not going to change China. China's going to change itself, or it won't be changed. But we can have more influence than we've had to date if we can focus on the way China views its own self-interest, and that's what I think we can change about American foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Farr. Professor Dr. Liu.
Thank you for all your hard work, sponsor, organizer, and all the friends here today. Gave me an opportunity to share something about China's on the religion's mechanism, on the management, on the religion. This is the topic. It's very complicated. I try to explain it in English, so I don't have a Chinese version, so I just follow this, hopefully, and you can understand that. But if sometimes I have to use Chinese, just forgive me. The topic I want to say is a mechanism of management on the religion in China, how it changed in the past decades. The first, you can see what is a foundation, is a base for the mechanism. To do anything, you have to have a way to do things. Same on the religion. For the government, just like any other government, we have to have a mechanism in order to deal with the religion. So we have a management on the religion. But people always simply ignore that. What is a religion policy? People rarely to think how it works and what is a specific way for this mechanism. So here I list this. Mainly, you can say we have some kind of principle. You all know that Marxism and the party make up policy. The way to do things is we have a political leadership and control on everything, including the religion. But in the early time before the reform, just like other things, we rule everything according to the documents we call the political leading or whatever you call it. It's simple ways, nothing with the rule of law. That's something you're all familiar before the economic reform. So when you make analysis on this kind of mechanism, you will say we have a model. This kind of model has specific features. A state guides the religion, just like other industrial, other business, same things. Like former Soviet Union countries, this is nothing surprise. Well, if we make a short conclusion, what is a mechanism, or how can a government manage a religion? What is a management? It's just two words. One is the party make a policy, another is the government implement it. So here is the form. You can see this clearly. So the party makes idea or produce idea or policy, and the government just deliver that or carry on that all the way down to the local level. The system of management. Here, I just try to point out two things. Not like a U.S. or other government. We do have a government, but we have two systems. One is for the party. I use CPC, as you all know that, Communist Party of China, which is just a party system. And the main job is make a political guidance. And among this system, you will see some details, just like this form. UFWD means United Front Work Departments. And the CPLA is a Committee of Political and Logistic Affairs, which is in a party system. And on the right, this is a government. Government has several different bodies or agents. SARA stands for State Administration of the Religion Affairs, which is a main organs to deal with the religion or religion affairs. PSB is Public Security Bureau. BSS is the Bureau of State Security. It's different. One is under the government, another is in the party. But they have some kind of relation, which is a political relation. Here is a government system. You can see government gave instruction through the different the agents, SARA, PSB, BSS. One thing I want to mention is, this is a little interest. SARA, or we call that RAB before, only deal with the legal religions organization, which is a recognized religion or religions group. For those who never register or unregistered or a new religion or folk faith, folk belief, all these things is not the job for SARA. It's the job for PSB, for Public Security Bureau. 宗教局管的是合法组织，这不合法的是公安局管的。So one time I chat with a police officer. I said, you shouldn't come to be in front. You should be behind. Now you make your job like a daily job, and you come to the front. It seems like you are another RAB. He said, that's something we don't want to do, but no choice. Then I said, after you, do you have other things? No, because you cannot use a military. That's the last one, last card. So before we only have a left, SARA dealing with religion organization, which is pretty simple. But now you can see it's very complicated. The system of management, you can see that if we want to do things, what we really do is how the policy traveled, which direction. This is a special subject. We may talk this in hours, but here I just gave you a simple idea. The one idea comes from the top, goes to the bottom, traverses lots. It's not just a simple decision. One office is involved lots of things, require lots of people, make many hours, documents, meetings, then goes to the street. Here you can see as a mechanism of management on religions is something we call the comprehensive coordination, which is a party government, the main one and some additional one. We all work together. Different level back to here. I just listed the major one. Actually, more than this. Each direction, you can see the moving. Actually, I didn't link the things on the same level. But you understand that the party gave instruction to the government gave instruction internally. vertical. But each level, they have to coordinate each other. They listen to their boss. Meanwhile, they have to talk to the same level office. So makes things very complicated. What government will manage? Several major things. One is personnel's organization things. Another is the main business for religion group is we call the 教务, is all the religion issues. Third one is 财务, 人事, 教务, 财务. All these things are important. If you look this kind of structure, you will get idea. No wonder the government can manage religion. It's not just a slogan or it's just not an idea. It's a structure. The political participant or participation in society is a special thing. I want to stop here for 1 second. People don't think this very much. Actually, this is another big job for government. Who should be a member of parliament or people's representative conference? And who should do what in society, like a charitable business? We have a Amity Foundation in Nanjing. Do we need a second, third one, or do we have a same one for Buddhism, Taoism? This is an issue, not just the religious organization, but for the government. This is the government as a business. So all these things make a daily work for government. Management by Public Security Bureau is another thing which is a different focus. It's not how to run religion. It's how to prevent the dangerous damage for society, like Christians, house churches, underground churches for the Roman Catholic, and someone in Tibet or Xinjiang, some new religions or religions known recognitions outside of the door. Jewish, Mormons, Baha'i, and Orthodox. Are they religion or not? How can they find their status? Where is their position? All these things no answer. Who will take care of them? Public Security Bureau. Someone got to do job on this. For the party's political agenda, this is something interesting. You can say how the government choose a target and what is a direction in the different area. So this slides give you a little idea. One thing I want to say is the religion policy never changed. Nobody said, oh, we have a different religion policy. We only have one from beginning till today. But the interesting thing is, in the different period, we actually have a different explanation or different agenda. Specifically, particularly focus agenda in that particular period. You all know this, before Cultural Revolution and Cultural Revolution and the post-Cultural Revolution. It's entirely different. Oh, by the way, I stop here for 1 second. Even for the organs, for the Office of the Religion Affairs Bureau was shut down. So that shows the one policy is just a different worldwide explanation according to the period, time. After the reform, you know, the open door policy, and we understand huge change taken place. That's the recent development. You all know that. Okay, now we got some points. What's happened today? So this is the real things I want to say. Before, we all know that it's part of history, but today is reality, which is government adopts a new policy and a reform, and one fundamental idea is to rule the society or government society not only based on the internal documents, but rule of law. Because of many, many good reasons. One major reason is WTO. China wants to play a role in the whole world internationally. Without this kind of legal change, legal reform, how can we get there? So the rule of law becomes some important things in our Constitution. It's a fundamental principle. We have to say PRC is a nation under the rule of law. We cannot say China is a nation under the rule of law with the exception on something like a religion. That's why religion policy or the management on religion has to be changed in a practical way because of the whole context, the whole background, whole society changed. Huge change already taken place. No matter you want or not, you must match that. That is a demand from society, from the time. Lots of reasons we can talk, but mainly we are in a new time, not just yesterday. Okay, what's the start point? Start point is rule of law. However, you can see this list. We have 5 levels legislation on religion. Highest is constitution. The lowest is autonomous regions. But for these 5 levels, the second one is real important. That's a problem. That's an issue. If we have a law on the second level, which is a law, it will be passed, or it could be passed by, you call the Congress, we call the People's Representative Conference, then we won't have a problem like today. The problem is we don't have a real law on the second level. As a law, the judges, lawyers can work. In other words, we do have a constitution. Underneath, we need a law to implement the constitution. If we don't have that one, then we have to have a lower one. That's a problem. So-called religious affairs regulations. Why is that? Because we don't have a law. We will talk that a little bit. The good things,
2分钟。
yeah, the good things, at least we have this kind of package as a legislation. So from there, I say that is a start point. We go from there. So now we have an administration and the law and the regulation. Both ways works. Of course, the last the one is also important. Academic debate is possible or allowable. So we can talk something, discuss something, even we don't have that one, at least we can talk. So why I mentioned the regulation of religion affairs is problem, because it does have some kind of significant problem with itself. You can say the problem here. How can you use a lower level law to function as a higher level law to replace what you say in the Constitution? That cannot work. Use a legal words. Violation. Who is violation? The church, the religion group, or government? So that's a very serious issue. 是违规还是违宪？是谁在违宪？Of course, we can't manage that. We can find a solution, but we need a consensus. Consensus for three. Do we need a law on religion or not? What kind of law we need? If U.S. doesn't have a law for religion, why we need that one? Someone argued. Our religions, people's believe in people's mind. How can you make a law to control that? That's not a simple question. We have a good reason behind. You can see that. Lots of reasons. Political reasons, religious reasons, security reasons, lots. The conclusion is the traditional religious management system couldn't work very well. Because of that, we have a numerous problems. We have to be realistic. We have to face reality. If we have some good system to meet the challenge today, we don't need to do anything as a reform. Otherwise, we have to do reform. The later change we do, the bigger price we have to pay, unless we have something function very well. Someone may say, oh, you have the administration management, you have a legal system. Which one is more important or which is bigger? I will say today both are important, but mainly according to administration way. But since it's changing, it's coming. If we talk the change, we have to back to the society with a bigger view. We cannot just make a religion as a religion since we have to say without the development of the whole society, without the development of the constitutionalism, you cannot really work out on religion issues itself. Civil society, constitutionalism is very necessary, very important. New leaders, I understand them. I think they will make new things, not just because they believe some religion, or they like religion, or they dislike religion. It's because of that kind of things related to the Communist Party's interest itself. How can you become a ruling party? You have to have a stability. You have to have a harmonious society. All these things very simple, but in order to do that, you have to manage all the things in a proper way. Rule of law will come, no matter you like or not. So government understand that. In the near future, the leaders will think about that and find a way to fix the whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. Ambassador Hanford will provide some discussion on the presentations.
I want to also add my thanks to the Asia Research Center Foundation and Dr. Caleb Zia and the Kissinger Institute, Ambassador Roy and Doug Spellman for all the effort they've put into organizing this conference and how important this topic is. And I just commend you for seeing the priority that this issue should take in this day and age. And I thank you, too, for our three panelists and their very substantive presentations. Obviously, a lot of thought has gone into your remarks, and we are the better for it. I've been asked to respond to the three presentations, and if I can get my watch to work here, I'll be able to make sure I don't go too long. Professor Liu's presentation is freshest in our minds, so why don't I start with that. His analysis was very sweeping and remarkable, and he's distilled an enormous amount of material into this one PowerPoint presentation. enough for many hours of discussion, frankly. Tom Farr made the interesting observation that in recent years, it may be true that universities in the U.S., some of them at least, give less place to the study of religion now than some universities in China because of the new interest there. And that's an ironic and humorous observation, but I think he's probably right in that. And I must say, listening to Professor Liu, that I wish that I had known some of these things earlier. I sat for hours and hours in negotiations with Chinese officials trying to figure out the labyrinth of government bureaucracies and all, and why the person I was sitting with couldn't help us advance, make progress on a particular problem. And it took me visit after visit, discussion after discussion, to finally get to the point of beginning to understand what he's just distilled. And I don't think our embassy understood it either. So you have gotten the Cliff Notes version of what took me an awful long time to get to the bottom of. I think perhaps most notable of what we come away with from Professor Liu's presentation is when he points to the way forward for us, or a possible way forward for a greater respect for religious freedom. Surely he's right that a crucial and necessary step will be for the government of China to move from a system that controls religion through a centralized management system to a system of rule by law, and the need for a basic law on religion and associated regulations. We need to see these laws and regulations put in place, and this is something that I raised many, many times and was frustrated in not being able to get a clear response on when this process was going to unfold. And I was given, we were given feedback that it would be fairly soon and work was being done on these sorts of laws. But one thing that I think will be of interest to many of you is that we did discuss very frankly with them and ask them, are you open to input from scholars and others, legal scholars in the U.S., on this process? And the answer was consistently yes. Now, our government has followed up on this, but there are many of you in the room. I see Cole Durham here, who I know is already involved in that process, but many others who can feed in a very profitable way. Professor Liu is also no doubt accurate and realistic when he grounds our expectations in reality, in warning us that a dualistic system that is part management and part law ruled will likely be the norm for a long time, as the role of law gradually increases. We would all rather see bold moves towards greater religious freedom, but my experience with China leads me to believe that he is probably right, that progress will continue to be somewhat slow and painstaking. And so for those of us that care about this, working on religious freedom in China will continue to be something that will take a lot more than just pointing fingers or speaking with a sharp tongue. It's going to take perseverance, and we're going to need people in it for the long run to work with the Chinese towards this goal. Each of us will build on the work of others, as I know I was building on the work of Ambassador Roy and Doug Spellman. In fact, in my first trip or two to China, Doug was the Consul General in Shanghai, and I got good help from his office when I was there. Professor Liu makes the point that the later change is delayed, the greater price will have to be paid. And surely he's right here. He's not specific about what he means here, but surely a price to religious freedom. But I think he also means to China and to the vitality of the Chinese people and to the sort of things that the country of China has missed out on without the full contribution of Chinese religious believers. And this is a point which Tom Farr so eloquently makes. Now, on Professor Liu, I'm trying to condense my remarks here a little bit. We are at a critical juncture, and pardon me, I was not here this morning, and some of this may have already been expressed this morning. But we are at a critical juncture in Chinese history where we may see some momentum. We can hope and pray for that along the lines that Professor Liu has referred to. As many of you know, the Politburo Standing Committee of the Communist Party will be having a major turnover very soon, where there's an almost unprecedented number of members that will be replaced. I could make a comment about mudslinging and political shenanigans and rumors going on. That might make you think that I was talking about U.S. politics, but actually that's going on in China to some extent right now too. The main difference is they do it behind the scenes and we do it more in the open, which I guess is an advantage of democracy. And some of this current behind-the-scenes struggle amongst the major groups that are vying for those seats may explain some of the recent persecution of religion that we have seen as this internal struggle goes on. In the 1980s and 1990s, we witnessed cycles, annual cycles of control and then a loosening of control. The summer and the fall, often leading up to the party plenary, we saw more of a crackdown on religious freedom. Then this would loosen in the spring as we were leading up to the National People's Congress. Lately, we've not been seeing extended periods where this loosening has occurred. But let us hope that a new generation of leaders will be more respectful and pragmatic in their treatment of religion, as I think Professor Liu has pointed the way. Now, in terms of Mr. Wong's presentation, we all can agree, as Tom has pointed out, with his leadoff point that religious freedom is good for the happiness of the Chinese people. Tom's comments on what should constitute religious freedom largely would mirror mine, and so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that. But I do think it's worth pointing out, as Professor Wong cited the UN Declaration of Human Rights, when the U.S. government goes in to meet with foreign governments, we are very clear that we are not there to necessarily impose or encourage the U.S. model of religion. We are there to encourage the international model, which is recognized in various covenants, not just the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but also the ICCPR and other international covenants. And in these covenants, a broader definition of what constitutes religious freedom and practice is spelled out. And this is what so many of us have been calling the Chinese too. Mr. Wong is right in implying that America, too, has had to evolve and grow in this realm. There have been periods of time in our early history and even not so early history when some religious minorities were persecuted. Quakers, I have relatives that were persecuted, Mormons, and so we have evolved and we continue to wrestle with certain aspects of what religious freedom looks like. But the fault lines are very different here than what he's describing. Now let me turn to Tom Farr's remarks. Tom has given us a very good overview of some of the major issues and cross currents which have shaped China's treatment of religion and religious freedom. He has often emphasized, and I can say that having worked with him, the importance of the freedom of religious practice filling a moral and spiritual void. And I can attest to the fact that Chinese officials have agreed with us on the need for this in China, particularly among the younger generation. He consistently has also made the point about how greater religious freedom would aid economic modernization and be a source of social capital and harmony. And I can vouch for the fact that he pounded the table on these issues when we worked together at the State Department in trying to win over more allies even within the building. I think Tom gives us specific recommendations that are very sound and worthy of follow-through. a more comprehensive and coordinated effort by the U.S. government to support legal reform and Chinese defense attorneys. And unfortunately, this latter point has been particularly problematic in the last year or two, as certain Chinese attorneys have been arrested or even tortured brutally. And this is a field that needs special emphasis, I think, right now. His point on supporting academic changes and dialogues, I think, is essential and very important, and one that he can greatly facilitate from his current perch. And also emphasizing in diplomacy the importance of China allowing each religious community to police its own notion of orthodoxy and training is something Tom didn't get around to today, but I think is a critical point. Tom calls on the U.S. government to do more, and I couldn't agree more with that. I fully agree that there is much more that we need to do. I can personally say that it was always a dilemma for me in my position as ambassador at large, because I would regularly say I could spend all of my time profitably just working on China and the problems there, given how complex they are, how extensive they are, and how important they are to address. Some people have questioned President Bush's commitment and the work that was done during his tenure, and I just want to say, having served full-time on religious freedom since Reagan's presidency and knowing a good bit about some of the presidents before him, we have had no president who raised this issue as strongly and as consistently as did President Bush with the government of China. And we worked very hard on it at the State Department in sharing that burden with him. I was, shortly after he was elected president, I was at an event at the American Jewish Committee, and he focused his comments at their annual banquet primarily on religious freedom issues in China. And this is the way President Bush put it: understanding my administration should not be difficult. Religious freedom has matured from a foundation of our domestic politics into a guiding doctrine of our foreign policy. He called religious freedom the first freedom of the human soul. And then he went on to say the United States views with special concern the intensifying attacks on religious freedom in China. China aspires to national strength and greatness, but these acts of persecution are acts of fear and therefore of weakness. And then he went through a litany of problems that he saw in the treatment of religious freedom in China. He raised these issues strongly in his first face-to-face meeting with Jiang Zemin shortly after being elected. And then about a year later, when he went back, as a condition of his trip to China, he insisted that he be allowed to address the entire nation of China on national live TV, uncensored. And he used that opportunity to address problems of religious freedom and human rights. And I saw him not long ago, and he still is burdened about this and still concerned to press these issues now that he's out of office. And his first trip since leaving the White House was to China, and again, he was raising religious freedom. I, too, my first trip as ambassador was to China, and Tom Farr was with me on that trip. While there are many things that I wish we could have worked more diligently on, I do believe that we saw general progress on some important fronts during both terms of the Bush administration. And I don't want to take credit for this. Sometimes people do that, and China is too big an issue for anyone to be able to raise their hand and say, my work was responsible for that. But I do believe President Bush's emphasis on this and the work that we did from the State Department, I think, had an impact. And I heard, as some of you perhaps have, that the Chinese government and Jiang Zemin were so surprised by the emphasis that President Bush placed on this issue in his first couple of trips that there was a lot of scurrying going on and insistence that the president should be better prepared, Jiang Zemin, the next time. And there was much more work done to bore down deep and understand religion, even within China, and issues of religious freedom for the sake of further dialogue with the U.S. We raised the whole panoply of issues during my time. I feel like we did not see significant progress, and in fact, in some cases, a deterioration of conditions when it comes to Tibetan Buddhists and Uyghur Muslims. We raised those issues faithfully, but there was not a trajectory that I feel good about. We also raised issues involving harsh attacks on underground churches and the banned Catholic Church that's affiliated with the Vatican, as well as with the Falun Gong, which is not a religion per se, but we raised their harsh suppression as well. And we did see some movement here. The Chinese government was willing to solidify certain policies that we felt were critical. One was the right of people to meet in homes and in small gatherings, friends and family. Now, it's one thing to get this agreement. It took us a while longer to get the Chinese government to come out publicly with this and to post it publicly so the citizens of China could see it. We focused in on the issue of the need for minors, children, to be able to be raised in the places of worship of their parents. This is still a serious problem in some places, particularly in the Uyghur Autonomous Region. But we have seen progress here because shortly before I went, there had been arrest. I remember of Catholics who had been catechized, young Catholics, or the teachers at least that had been involved in this. And so we've seen an improvement there. We did raise serious cases. I remember one that had involved terrible torture of a number of people, and one particular pastor who was about to be executed was spared, and his sentence was reduced. And that's almost unheard of in China, to see a sentence reduced. And yet, between my first and second trip, a period of only 4 months, one of the Buddhist monks that I had raised had been executed. At least we have the clear conscience of knowing that we pressed his case, but that was a very sad outcome. We also raised the cases of leading Uyghur Muslims, such as Rabia Kadir. And I think it's significant and important for the Muslim world to know that she became our #1 prisoner of conscience for a significant period of time until her situation, until she was able to come to the U.S. I think what I would point to in particular during the Bush administration is the fact that there was a general improvement in a backing off of aggressive behavior towards particularly Christian groups. There were not as many raids or beatings or torture, and instead what we have today is that arguably hundreds of thousands of house churches are meeting without harassment. Now, recently, in the last year or two, there have been some serious exceptions to this. There are always exceptions to this every year. But when you look at the number of those exceptions up against the total number that are being allowed to practice peacefully, I think there's much to feel good about. And Professor Liu points to the fact that there has been a general trajectory of progress over the last couple of decades, and I would agree with that, especially up until the last year or two, and I think this is encouraging for the long run. I frankly was
2 minutes, please.
I also was frankly shocked to see how much in the way of religious literature is now allowed, and amazingly is actually published by the government of China in some cases, or approved for state-controlled universities to publish. And if you go into a bookstore in China, it's really remarkable to what extent they have been willing to allow different faiths to have literature to build up believers in those faiths. Now, this is partly a money-making incentive here. They make quite a bit of money off of this, but nevertheless, as I've told them, you can keep making money off of it. I think this is a good sign of progress. The Catholic Church has seen improved relations over the last 3 or 4 years, up until recently, and unfortunately, with the illicit ordination of several people, these relations have soured, and hopefully they will improve again soon. Well, let me just sum up then by saying that it'll be a privilege to work with many of you as we continue to work on this. I'm committed to this for the long run, and we all need to have that spirit of vigilance as we work together on this. And let me just close with a statement by President Bush, which I think sums up well what many of us believe. This persecution is unworthy of all that China has been, a civilization with a history of tolerance. And this persecution is unworthy of all that China should become, an open society that respects the spiritual dignity of its people. And I think we can all say amen to that. Again, thank you to the Institute and to my fellow panelists.
Thank you, Ambassador Hanford, for those very comprehensive comments. I think we've seen a unifying theme, if you will, between our first panel today and our second panel. In the first panel, we learned how the history of the relationship between state and church in China is so different from the models that we in the West are more familiar with. And in our panel here on religious freedom, we have this interesting juxtaposition where the First Amendment to the United States Constitution provides that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or restricting or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And in China, we find we need a religious law in order to give effect to the provisions in the Chinese Constitution for religious freedom. So clearly, there are differences in approach between China and the United States in dealing with religious issues, and I think we've had an opportunity to get a full exposure to the differences in viewpoint in this area. We have enough time for some questions. The floor is open. Yes. Wait for a microphone, please, and identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Walton. I'm from the National Bureau of Asian Research in Seattle. Happy to be visiting. I was going to ask Thomas Farr a question, if that's okay. Since we're sort of on a policy orientation here, I was sort of wondering, there seems to be a lot of short-term political incentives to make a big fuss about religious freedom in China that may or may not be in a productive manner that actually gets change accomplished. Since a lot of people seem to be, both on the Chinese side and the American side, sort of playing for domestic audience more than trying to sort of accomplish concrete goals, objectives in some cases. I was wondering, is there really room to have sort of concrete objectives like some of the ones you suggested, when oftentimes on the top level there tends to be a lot more hostility and sort of drum beating about this issue? Is that tension productive, and is there any way to sort of have the top level discussions and the sort of more practical discussions sort of more harmonious and sort of pushing for a policy change?
Boy, that's a great question. And I'll try not to go on and on. I think, let me answer that by saying there's currently, or has been until very recently, an amendment going through the Congress to the International Religious Freedom Act, which is the law that created the policy, the ambassador at large, and so forth. That amendment, in my opinion, was addressing the issue that you just raised, namely, what has emerged over the last 12 years is an awful lot of talk and very few programs that are structural in nature that really try to get in front of the problem. I mean, this is a democracy. You're always going to have the kinds of problems that you're talking about, and there's certainly nothing wrong with members of Congress responding to their constituents. I mean, that's what democracy is all about. But the burden, the problem is looking at this as a strategic issue, a long-term issue that requires the allocation of some resources and so forth. This particular amendment to the Religious Freedom Act, first of all, reauthorized the commission, which is still up in the air. It's under a continuing resolution. I think it would be a terrible, terrible sign to the world, China included, if the commission were simply dropped. But the others were for the State Department, taking the position of the ambassador at large, for example, and put it where it should have been in the first place, under the Secretary of State. State Department has lots of, not lots, but a number of ambassadors at large. All but one of them, well, all but two of them work for the Secretary of State. Traditionally, this has been true. The ambassador at large has always worked under a lower-ranking official in the Human Rights Bureau at the State Department. This tells people that it's not a priority. It tells Foreign Service officers that. It tells foreign governments that. That's just one example. Another example was training for Foreign Service officers, and perhaps most importantly of all in this context, some funds, not new money, but funds taken from other programs to give to the ambassador at large so that he or she, in this case she, could actually begin to implement some of the long-term programs that we're talking about. So I think the answer to your question is yes, you can. You must meld them together. We're not going to get rid of democracy. We don't want to do that. And people's responding to their constituents and giving great speeches. But words are words. And in order to do this right, in my view, we need to develop programs.
Thanks.
Thanks for your question.
Yes, over here. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay. I'm Carla Simon from Catholic University of America. I wanted to raise a couple of points, actually more critique. I'm a scholar and a professor, and so I'm maybe more in the critique mode than in the question mode.
Carla, if you're going to critique me, I have to leave.
No. This is not a cross-town.
Please just keep an eye on the clock, though, because we have limited time.
Catholic issue. I'm good at that. First of all, I would like to say that the title is Western Perspectives. We haven't heard anything much about Western perspectives. We've heard about the U.S. And one of the things about China is that China is a country in the civil law tradition where you might find more of this anti-cult legislation, which may be more acceptable in China than it would be in the United States. So I think that's important to mention. So France has such a thing, Belgium has such a thing, etc. Secondly, by virtue of being in the civil law tradition, what Professor Liu is talking about, which is having a law on religion, is consistent. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily think you need one. I'm an American, but a civilian lawyer might think you might need one. But with respect to what Professor Wong said, I'm really doubtful about your distinction between religious belief and religious activity. Remember, when the Universal Declaration was signed in 1948, there were other provisions in there, one of which talked about freedom of expression, the other one of which talked about freedom of association. You simply cannot divorce, as you said, John, you cannot divorce freedom of religious belief with the freedom to practice your religion. And they get knitted together again in the ICCPR. But it's I think a very empty statement about what freedom of religion is if you simply say it's just freedom to believe. So that's my critique.
Just a little side note here. I was intrigued on one of my first couple of visits to China to learn that the head of the Committee on Cults from France had just been there to advise the Chinese government. So that supports your point that there is some synergy there in the mindset.
Okay.
Yep, Professor Wong would like to respond.
Okay, yes, please.
好，这个谢谢这位教授的这个意见，你的意见我仍旧会认真的考虑，但是我根据自己的长期的思考，我认为，在中国社会当前的处境之下，如果不做适度的区分，会误导民众，这个而 一些外国的一些西方的学者在观察中国的这个宗教自由现状的时候，如果完全不做区分，也容易误导。我想利用这个机会，我再对刚才这个汉佛大使和这个 Thomas 巴教授讲的几点，我再补充一下我的几点简单的看法。一个呢，刚才两位这个的发言呢，对他们对中国的这个宗教的现状呢，我认为是比较了解的比较多过那个 David Ackerman。另外呢，我想说的呢，你们提到的一些事情，我作为一个研究者，我也或多或少的关注过，或者在某种程度上参与过。我记得有一年，美国国务院这个宗教自由这方面那个部门到北京，应这个中国的某个部门的邀请，到北京去访问。当时美国大使馆的文化处新闻处就邀请了在京的学者去座谈。还有那一年，布什总统到清华大学来做讲演。我是自始至终知道那个事情的过程，而且我也在学校，在布什总统还没有到清华来讲演之前，我在全校给学校领导、给各个院系的参加演讲的老师，还有给600多名学生，专门的做了3场辅导。我给他们讲的意思，一个是介绍美国宗教的现状，第二是介绍布什总统个人的宗教信仰，第三就是告诉我们这些参加听演讲的这个师生，是吧？就是在听布什总统的演讲的时候，我们也一定要了解美国的这个整个宗教文化的这个背景。一个目的，为了共同的促进中美这个关系的友好，也提醒这些老师和同学们，在那样一个重大的外交场合，要注意提问的适当性。所以呢，我感到呢，就是你们2位对这个中国的这个宗教自由现状的这个情况是比较了解的。我是真的是希望以后我也能有更多的机会向你们请教，因为尽管我的观点可能和你们很不一样，但是我认为你们是了解的，也是深入的思考过的。所以我下面给你们2位提几点建议。第一，任何一个结论、观察的结论，实际上都是通过比较得出来的。你们的结论，你们有一个参照系；我的结论、我的观察也有一个参照系。而我发现呢，我的结论之所以和你们差别很大，重要的一条，我经常拿中国的现在跟30年以前的中国比，甚至跟更早的60年以前的中国比，我们说的再早一些，1840年那个时候的中国比。而你们的话呢，你们的参照系是另外一个。所以的话呢，这个就是我们的结论啊什么的。所以我给你们提的建议是：第一，你们在以后对中国宗教信仰自由的现状做出判断的时候，你们要明确你们的参照系。如果你这个参照系选择是不恰当的，那你的结论也不容易被别人所接受。这是第一个建议。第二个建议，你们所使用的一系列的术语，你们用的这个话语系统，对中国的现状而言，已经有许多是过时的了。比如 persecution， 还有一系列的这样一些，在我看来，在中国的语境中间是一个政治用语。你们刚才也已经讲了，中国的现在的这个宗教管理，要由过去的统治、政治统治，向公共管理 去转化，这是一个很大的一个进步。国内你们也在某些场合也肯定了，我也知道这10多年来大批的学者，包括刘鹏这样的教授，一直都在为那个要从原来的单一的行政管理向法治去转化。尽管我们说这个过程还很不完善，但是你们也已经看到了这个，你现在在对他做出评价的时候，你仍旧用一套过去那个政治那个术语来评价，你这叫对方，或者说你批评的对象，或者是要对整个中国社会，怎么能够接受呢？还有一点，我想就是对中国社会对宗教的认识，是各个层次的人是很不一样的。今天这个上午，这个有一位教授提出来说啊，比如讲到守望教会的事情，后来说那位教授就提问，他其实这个事情我们研究的人关注，政府管理部门某些管理部门关注，其实其他人呢，没人关心他，没有人在乎他。这个就说明中国这个社会太大，层次也太复杂，各个群体对同样的事情他的关注度是不够的，同样各个群体对宗教的认识也是有极大差异的。中国到现在为止，绝大多数人我仍旧得说他对宗教的认识非常非常的肤浅。我曾经在我写的书中间我讲了，现在的中央领导人最高的这个国家的 top leader 是吧，对宗教问题是非常的重视，也有很深的认识。但是呢，中国的这个管理体制呢，各个层次的人呢，你下到农村里头，下到一个乡里头，乃至于你下到一个县里头，你乃至于去到一个具体的地方，你具体的去看看那些各个层次的这个政府的这个他们对宗教的认识呢。所以我们现在在讲到这个宗教的认识的时候，我们一定，你们在做这个判断的时候，不要混淆一般与个别，把某一个层次的认识理解为整个中国的认识。你们刚才提到是吧，关于马克思主义、列宁主义的宗教观，那么你现在看看我们在座的有那么多学者年龄可能我这个算大一些，其他几位学者也很年轻，还比我年轻，但是我们所接触的，我们的老师的老师，还有或者说我们的学生的学生，你去看看他们的认识会是怎么样的。现在到底还有多少人完全认为宗教等于鸦片，宗教等于迷信，基督教等于洋教，还有多少人是这么看的？所以你们本身在判断对这个中国的宗教自由现状的时候，一个前提就是中国人现在对宗教的基本的看法，中国人的这个认识，你们了解了各个层次的认识以后，你会得出一个一般的看法，不会拿一个观点一种看法当作是全部的看法。
我们时间已经到了
好，最后我请允许给我很短的那个，最后请允许我呢对这个美国的国际宗教自由委员会你们这些年做的工作，我发表一个我个人的一个评价。刚才 Thomas 发先生他在讲，他说他们是在用负面的方法去推进中国的宗教自由的。他同时也提到，没有人能改变中国，只有中国人自己能改变中国。我认为他后面讲的话是一个真理。而所谓的用负面的方法去推进重要的自由，如果我们看它的结果，它实际上不是在推进，而是在推后。什么道理呢？中国人，你如果把中国看作是一个鸡蛋，你用压力一压下去，压扁了，你说中国宗教自由的状况改变了。可是你们现在也清清楚楚地看到，中国这个国家，中国这个民族，它的特点不怕压的，它有时候是弹簧，它有时候是刺猬，你要给它压力，它给你来一下子。 所以你们说你们在评价你们这个委员会的起的作用，我其实也一直在关注着。我认为你们的出发点可能是好的，因为我讲了，他关注中国宗教自由的人啊，我认为我的假设的前提，你们都是为了中国社会的长治久安，都是为了全中国人民的幸福，所以我假定你们也是属于这个范围的。但是这个实际后果呢，我认为啊，真的是比较，我也比较，真的有点，我不太好再往下说了。这个
OK，
我最后我就是希望是吧？这个大使先生，这个真正的是吧？观察你们的工作的方式要和他的实际要联系起来。他如果我知道美国人是最讲这个实用主义的，这个实用主义的标准判断一个事情你真理与否的标准，就是看它的最后后果。你们如果做这件事情，不按照你们这个最能反映你们这个民族精神的这个实用主义哲学，不看它的最后后果，你说我这个出发点是很好的。实际上呢，因为我认为对美国了解的还比较多啊，我对英国也了解的比较多。我的太太，我的家人，我有一次坐在家里，我就感到吃惊。他一看到那个新闻里放出来啊，这个美国人又跑去管什么事儿了？他马上冒出一句话，说是国际警察。哎，我说你这个观念是从哪里来的？我说我接触的美国人他们都很好啊，他们天天在帮助我啊，你怎么会有这个观念呢？哎，我后来反省了一下，你们可能真的是出发点是好的，但是你们的方式是不恰当的。所以我的意见就到这儿啊，谢谢，我说多了，对不起。
Okay.
The discussion is just getting interesting, but Ambassador Hanford would like to have 1 minute of comment.
Well, first, let me make it clear that Tom Farr did not march out in protest to your comments, Professor Wong. He had to transform into a professor himself. He had a class to teach. I think you make some valid points. I think it is important for us to be ready and willing to acknowledge progress in China. I hope I did a little bit of that on the religious freedom front when it occurs. I also, and I think it's true sometimes people are too sweeping in their condemnations. And it's important to point to where things are getting better and where they're getting worse. I think you're right that we have to look at the local context, sometimes separate from other context, although it has been disturbing recently to see problems increasing both in urban and rural areas, but I hope this is just a temporary hiccup. I think your point about the people of China and their attitudes toward religion being so crucial here is absolutely an important point to make. And frankly, I think this is where the real impetus for change is coming. I think the Chinese people themselves are becoming more respectful of religion and of religious believers. And even though I believe the Pew research has recently indicated a bit of a retrogression on this point, overall, the trajectory is one that shows that as a nation, there's a growing respect for the contribution that religious believers can make. I fully agree with you that when we look at the long-term history of China, there is much to be satisfied and pleased about in terms of the improvement that has occurred over the last 30 years, and I think it's essential that we not lose track of that. I think what many Americans and Westerners and others hope for is that the remarkable changes we've seen on the economic front can be mirrored now on the civil society front, including with religious freedom.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and then we take a brief coffee break.